Should women be allowed to use the women's restroom? Public bathrooms, the place where none of us like to go, especially when we're teenagers. Between our voices getting higher, our schools forcing us to somehow take a dump and still get to class on time, all in the matter of 4 minutes, and trying to put Stacy's mom in our contacts so we can call her later, school bathrooms are a nightmare for students. In fact, more than 19% of children say they do everything they can to avoid using the school or public restrooms. This leaves hundreds of thousands of children each year at risk of soiling and wetting accidents in the classroom, urinary tract infections, constipation problems, general anxiety, and worst of all, for many students, even those not included in that 19% estimate from before, avoid eating and drinking throughout the day, which leads to dehydration and malnutrition, under the mistaken belief that this will stop the need for them to use the restroom at all. And sure, part of this is due to the fact that school and public restrooms are extremely dirty, or at least they look dirty. In researching this piece, public health officials told us that while public restrooms may look dirty and grimy, chances are they don't offer much actual risk to your health, as long as you're responsible. But that's sort of undercut by the insanely gross feeling I have now, knowing that 25% of people using public restrooms forget to wash their hands. But these problems are minuscule compared to the problems faced by the transgender and gender non-conforming communities. So today we thought it was time we take an in-depth look at the transgender bathroom debate. In the past, you might have come across ads like this one, from the Alliance Defending Freedom hate group.
One day when I was in school, I walked into the bathroom and I saw a reflection of a man. My body went into immediate shock.
Hate groups like this one spend millions of dollars on ads, plaster them on every local network they can find, and even include sob stories like this one from Alexis, which first tells you how she was in the foster care system and felt like she lost her voice.
When I was in foster care, I didn't interact with anyone. I completely lost my voice because of being in foster care. I just wasn't who I was supposed to be. I was an orphan.
And while that might be a true story, they do this so later in the video, when it comes time to tell you about the trans person she meets in the restroom, and when Alexis says, quote, "My parents taught me that your voice matters, you have a say in this world," you feel compelled to take sympathy for Alexis. The only problem with ads like this and stories like this one is it either never happened at all, or they are horribly misrepresenting the truth to fit their personal agenda. But this happens across the country and around the world. Anytime a bill is introduced to protect transgender and gender nonconforming individuals in the restroom, ads like this one suddenly appear to scare the public.
Any man at any time could enter a woman's bathroom simply by claiming to be a woman that day. Registered sex offenders could follow women or young girls into the bathroom.
And it is scary because it's meant to scare you. If I didn't know any better, and if I was a parent of a little girl, I would be terrified watching this ad, knowing that if a certain law passed in my state or country, that my little girl could have a registered sex offender or man follow her into the restroom to abuse, rape, or harm her, it would be terrifying. So terrifying that I would call my representative or senator to stop that bill from passing. But it is odd though. First off, we always hear about this little girl being followed by a predator. But oddly in these ads, we never ever hear about a boy being followed by a woman. It's almost as if these hate groups did the same research we did for this piece and asked if parents worry more about their daughters than their sons. It's almost as if they found the ample evidence that we did, proving that a majority of parents believe their sons can protect themselves, but their little girls cannot. It's almost like these hate groups and their millions of dollars in funding really helps in their research here. Now, Of course, I cannot legally say they spend their hundreds of millions of dollars in funding this research, whether parents worry more about their daughters than their sons, and they spend millions more making an ad to fit that narrative so it scares parents, but, I mean, I'm not one to say that you can't draw your own conclusions here. Getting back to their videos and looking at them as an LGBTQ professor, I'm intrigued, I have to say. Obviously, with that sort of claim, they have some evidence to back it up, right? But nowhere on the screen or in the video at all does it show you their source for that scary claim. But they have millions of dollars in funding to do the research for these things. Obviously, they wouldn't tell you blatant lies in their advertising just to scare you and then provide you a website link so you can send them money. There would be no financial incentive to that, right? I mean, they wouldn't lie to you for money. Well, according to a study conducted by the Williams Institute at UCLA School of Law, quote, there is no evidence that letting transgender people use public facilities that align with their gender identity increases safety risk, end quote. Now, a moment ago, I told you it was odd that these hate groups would put out a video without any sources or evidence being shown on screen. And as a professor, I find it convenient that UCLA School of Law lists not just their entire study, but all of their anecdotal evidence to prove their claim on their website. It's almost like one of these people is lying just to scare you for donations, and the other, which has no horse in the race, is telling the truth and providing all the evidence to back their claim. So the two questions which are raised here are quite simple. First, what harm is there in a transgender person using the bathroom which corresponds to their gender identity? In other words, what harm is there in letting a woman use the women's restroom in school or in public accommodations? The trans community has been asked this question over and over again, but their answer has always stayed the same. They just want to use the restroom and get out. As we mentioned in the beginning of this piece, no one wants to be in the bathroom for longer than they have to be, and 19% of people avoid it at all cost. In fact, we sat down with a transgender activist last year to ask her this nagging question.
I've got to tell them, and I do. Do you honestly think that I'm going to go through the pain of loss, of rejection, discrimination, the expense that I put out to make my body the way it is? You think I go through all of this just so I can go into a public restroom? If I'm going into a public restroom at all, I'm going for one reason, people. I don't care. I'm in and out of there.
But still, hate groups like the Family Research Council will lead you to believe that letting a woman use a women's restroom is just an attack against common sense.
It's common sense, actually, that's under attack. Throughout human history, we have separated biological males and biological females for the purpose of some of these activities, such as bathing, dressing, and going to the bathroom.
And even though Peter Sprake here is on TV and looks all professional, a simple Google search would tell him that he's lying to viewers. In fact, the first sex-segregated toilets were established in Paris in the 1700s. It wouldn't be until 1887 that the first American state passed regulations requiring men and women to use separate restrooms, and even that was limited to private businesses, not public or school restrooms. And maybe Peter doesn't know this, but human history goes back a lot further than just 1887. So why scare people with these attack ads and spread false information? Well, the truth is we don't really know exactly why they're doing it, other than to spread hatred and discriminate against others. What we do know is, though it was riddled with lies there, his talking points were carefully worded. Remember when he said biological males and biological females? Well, that's actually something a lot of transphobic people do to undermine the science of being transgender, which is completely valid, by the way. It's their way to claim trans people should not scientifically be this way. But if his words weren't so harmful to millions of people worldwide, his words would be almost comical. Scientifically speaking, transgender people are born the gender they were always meant to be. Their parents, doctors, and society get it wrong and label them as the incorrect gender too soon. because as we mentioned before on this show, gender is determined by your brain and not your genitals. So Peter, if you're watching out there, maybe take a science class. I hear we have one available for free. So now that we know that allowing a transgender person to use the restroom matching their gender identity and allowing a woman to use a women's restroom is completely harmless, it brings up another great question. What harm is there in forcing a trans person to use the opposite gender restroom, which does not correspond to their gender identity, but instead corresponds to their sex assigned at birth? This situation happens far more often than you might assume. In fact, more than 60% of transgender students report having been prohibited from using the bathroom or locker room that aligns with their gender identity. And the harm this does to the student is immediate and severe. 76% of trans students feel unsafe at school because of their gender. 70% of trans students report verbal harassment for using the restroom which does not align with their gender identity. And when school administrators force trans students to use the wrong restrooms like this, the transgender student is the only one at risk. Remember how I said a moment ago that when UCLA looked at the data here and determined there was no link between allowing a trans person to use the appropriate restroom and the violence, assault, and other harms that these hate groups said that it caused? Well, the data is pretty clear on the opposite of that too. When schools force transgender students to use the restroom not aligning with their gender identity, 70% of trans students in these wrong restrooms experience verbal abuse, 36% report being sexually assaulted, and 10% reported being physically assaulted by cisgender people. It's no wonder why schools which implement these transphobic policies and force transgender students to use the restroom against their gender identity results in a few key things. First, a school would experience higher bullying rates and higher discrimination. Next, the school typically notices a lower overall GPA of students, higher rate of students dropping out, higher rate of school discipline, and lower educational aspirations. And finally, the school loses some funding because when a school doesn't deliver good results of GPA scores, graduation rates, and so on, the federal government giving you funding isn't too happy that you're not delivering on your promises. Not to mention the fact that schools which force transgender students to use the restroom against their gender identity also force their trans students to have higher levels of depression and lower self-esteem, resulting in these students becoming more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol compared to the general population. So let's quickly recap. If your school allows a trans student to use the appropriate restroom which matches their gender identity, the trans student is safer, is more comfortable using the restroom at school, is happier, and will use a restroom like everyone else and get back to class. As for everyone else in the school, it does them zero harm. On the other hand, if your school forces a trans student to use the restroom against their gender identity, it puts the trans student in serious verbal, physical, and sexual harm's way. It pushes them to drop out of school early, get lower grades overall, get bullied, and pushes them to drugs and even suicide. But let's say you ignore the blatant facts in front of you, and because of the lies these hate groups told you in their advertising, you're still scared of someone else being in the stall next to you. Well, lucky for you, these hate groups have a solution. They argue to just give transgender students a restroom of their own and force every trans student in the entire school to go to the nurse's office to use the restroom instead of going to the one that everyone else uses. But this separates the trans student and gives the impression to every other student in the school that they are somehow different and should therefore be treated differently. This again leads to greater bullying, physical and verbal assault, dropout rates, lower GPA scores, drugs, and so on. You get the idea. So this clearly isn't the solution either. But don't worry, hate groups have the answer though. Just have all the students go to the restroom, then wait for the room to be empty, and then send the trans student in by themselves. Well, Minersville School District in Pennsylvania, United States, tried that. How did it work for them? Well, they did this repeatedly to a little girl entering first grade, even going as far as to tell the little girl that their school and their town just wasn't ready for a transgender student. They blatantly broke federal regulations on this, mandating that a school must allow a trans student to use the restroom aligning with their gender identity. In November of 2017, as a result of that discrimination, the family of that little girl sued the school for violation of the federal regulations and violation of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The school, which knew the evidence was monumental against them, chose to settle the case out of court. The school ended up paying the little girl and her family over $250,000 for pain and suffering restitution. The school tried to hide their financials for as long as they possibly could, but being public record, eventually the taxpayers started showing up to school board meetings, asking what the $250,000 expense was for. And before a right-to-know request was officially made, they finally told the public about the court case. That's when many local residents complained how a few staff members cost the school district so much money. They complained about why this little girl got so much money, but they never stopped to realize the school itself was this little girl's biggest bully in life. They caused all of her classmates to think of her as different, and no matter how much re-education they do on this topic in the future, that little girl will have classmates who view her as nothing more than transgender. And that is the biggest point in all of this. Not to allow your school to be your child's first and biggest bully in life. Hate groups will say they don't want men to enter women's restrooms. They don't want women in men's restrooms either. But newsflash, none of us do. Cisgender and transgender alike. But yet these hate groups are spending millions of dollars every year to make that very thing happen. Why? Because they know the statistics like we do. They know trans people, if they get their way, will end up being verbally, physically, and sexually assaulted, and likely will go on to have depression and commit self-harm, if not suicide. But they don't care. In fact, I would argue that is their end goal here. These hate groups sometimes do offer solutions. For instance, you remember Peter Sprigg from our story before. Well, he thinks that if you're attractive enough, maybe you'll pass without anyone noticing you're trans.
So only well-dressed women can go into the ladies' room. Is that what you're saying? Only women that are attractive, just like the Donald Trump thing. Only women that are attractive can have these positions or use the restroom in this case.
Well, if you appear to be female, then you probably will not be challenged.
But as for trans people, well, according to the hate group Family Research Council, a lot of trans people aren't attractive at all.
What would make you uncomfortable with me using the women's restroom?
She's a very attractive woman.
Well,
very.
A lot of transgender people are not. A lot are not convincing in their presentation as the opposite of their biological sex. And so it's obvious to the people who see them that this is actually a man in a dress and not a biological woman. And that can create, I can understand how that would create fear and anxiety on the part of women and girls in a ladies' room.
They want to scare you to think child predators and rapists will follow your little girl into the restroom if these laws are passed. But I beg of you to actually read the bills yourself. Nowhere in any of the transgender protection bills does it say anything about protecting child predators, rapists, or any other criminal, especially not protecting an imaginary predator. You know why? Because it's an imaginary problem these hate groups came up with, because they did their research. And they know parents around the world worry about their little girl being defenseless in a public restroom. But even if the problem wasn't completely made up by the hate groups to scare you, I guarantee we'd all be on the same page here. No one, transgender or cisgender people alike, no one wants a child predator in a restroom with their children. No one is arguing for that. And if the imaginary problem was happening, I'd say the school has a lot more to worry about than a little girl trying to use the girls' restroom. So in the meantime of these hate groups introducing you to children to tear at your heartstrings over a made-up story, we thought we'd tell you a little story of our own. This is Lucy. All she wants to do is use the little girl's restroom in her school. But this is Peter Sprague, and he wants boys to be in the girls' restrooms and girls to be in the boys' restrooms by law. In fact, his organization is spending millions of dollars every year to make it happen in states across the country. You see, if Lucy is forced to use the wrong restroom, chances are she will be made fun of by other students. She'll be beaten up, and chances are she'll be sexually assaulted by other students in her school because she was forced to use the boys' restroom by our old friend Peter here. All because people wrongfully thought Lucy was a boy back when she was born. Peter thinks that you have to be attractive enough as a 10-year-old girl to be permitted to use the restroom. And Peter knows that if he gets his way, Lucy will be forced to drop out of school. All because he's afraid of Lucy going in the stall and taking a tinkle. Yep, Peter's afraid of a little 10-year-old girl. But for the rest of us who understand how traumatizing middle school restrooms actually are, we want Lucy to feel safe enough to actually go to the bathroom. Because unlike Peter, we took an oath to keep our students safe. So please, allow transgender students like Lucy to just live their lives normally and use the restroom that aligns with their gender identity. But if you somehow agree with Peter and want to judge if a 10-year-old girl is attractive enough to use the restroom, I can pretty much guarantee you're one of 4 people who don't wash their goddamn hands before going back to class. In which case, yeah, maybe we should have a separate bathroom for you. Anyway, if you want to learn more about the LGBTQ community, check out this playlist right here or subscribe for weekly episodes. And if you want to see bloopers from every episode and behind the scenes, consider becoming a member of our channel by hitting join down below. As always, I'm your host, Professor Pride. Have a gay day, everyone, and bye for now.